Okay, good morning, folks. Everyone sort of straggling when they do. Um, First off, what I want to do is I want to reiterate, well, I actually want to go back to something I mentioned, I think, a couple of weeks ago when I was talking about this sort of cycle of tourism. And let's segue out of this. I don't think I actually mentioned what happened, but if I do remember mentioning that this whole timeshare thing collapses. And again, timeshares were this idea that you could actually buy a week's worth of an apartment or buy a week's worth of a hotel. And so what you did is you didn't buy the unit, you bought, 1/52nd of it. And that also included, that would include whatever the 1/52nd of the maintenance fees or, whatever it would be. Um, for some reason, this was hugely popular in the 70s and early 80s. I think because what it meant is people felt that if there was a place they really liked, it guaranteed that they could be there in a place they were comfortable with for a week or 2 weeks, and they would have it forever. One of the big sales points of timeshares was that you could then actually trade them. We were peripherally involved with the company that actually built an app back in the early 80s where you could actually trade your 2 weeks of one of the Maui timeshares to someone in, say, I don't know, Cozumel that has a timeshare there. So there was a whole sort of business, and people saw it as an investment. They saw it as a very, I think they saw it as a low risk investment. It certainly was a low cost investment. So in the case of Maui, which was really sort of the hub of this in Hawaii, to a lesser extent Kauai on the South Shore, there's sort of an attitude that for, maybe, I don't know, I'm just making up a number, $30,000 to $60,000, you could basically buy a piece of paradise. And there's no way that you could afford to buy a condo, nor did you want to take care of it for a whole year when you only wanted to use it for a couple of weeks. So I think people saw it as I don't want to use the word practical, but I guess they saw it as sort of a reasonable way to make sure that they could go back to a place they liked. And I think the attitude also was there'd be a higher comfort level because if you actually own 1 or 2 weeks in one of the Kanapali timeshares, what that meant is when you went back there after the second or third time, you know how everything worked. You know what you wanted to do. So it was sort of like a version of maybe like your backyard. So sort of the mental attitude. A huge part of this industry, and again, I've never seen a particularly good study done of the timeshare industry. Maybe there has been. I probably haven't looked for it. Was Canadians. A large part was folks from places like Colorado, which was already an area where for some reason there was a tremendous amount of money available. And there's a tremendous interest in purchasing things here in Hawaii. So a lot of these folks are coming from Colorado, especially Denver area, but a huge number coming from Canada. And so Canadian timeshare investment was a huge thing. And in fact, if we go to Kanapali, let's switch here. Okay, here's Kanapali down here. So the line is down this way. This whole stretch here, all the way up till you get to Kapalua. The vast majority of all this was timeshares. Now we're not talking like timeshares like an Airbnb. We're talking like timeshares like, let's see if I can actually get a picture here. Sorry, I have to move this over. That was pretty useless as a shot. Sorry about that. Come on, babes. Let's go this way. No, I don't want to do that. I'll go down here. Go to the intersection. Should be able to see it from the intersection. Okay. So everything you see down here is timeshares. And a lot of these are 3, 5, 7-story, I don't know what you call sort of like medium high rises. They're not small. So all these things are built. Some of these are now houses, but all these are built with the intent of basically tapping this enormous what seemed to be almost permanent pent-up market demand for these, in fact, you can see a better one on the shore here. This is a good example here. So all these are timeshares. Here's one of the older ones here. Oh, actually, wait. I think we can actually pull it here. Let's see if we can pull it on the street. Okay, there's one of the perfect, that's one of the classic timeshares. 2, 3, 4 story. Builders could put these things up literally in a few months. They're not particularly sturdy. They were all made out of, largely wood. So these things are sort of put up, when you look at the construction, because we used to see a lot of these going up, they almost looked like they were disposable. So this was a quick turnaround. Someone could buy a piece of property, a builder could slap something up pretty quick, and you could immediately get loads of people that want to buy, this unit here for 2 months in May, or I mean for 2 weeks in May, and someone else wants 2 weeks in November. So as fast as they were building these things before the paint even dried, they basically had sold the timeshares in them. Heavily advertised in the mainland, and especially popular, like I said, Colorado, but most importantly with Canada. Canadians just jumped on this. And I'm not particularly sure, and here you see the same thing on this side. I'm not particularly sure what it was about Canada. I mean, my stereotype of Canada is it gets cold in the winter, but for whatever reason, they just really thought the timeshares were a good idea. And all this was just going along swimmingly. Everyone was in a good old time. There were occasional burps. One of the main ones was being that these things were so poorly built in many cases, and not surprisingly, after a couple of years, they started to leak. Your maintenance cost went up, and all of a sudden, someone who was paying maybe $150 for their 2-week, maintenance fee for the 2 weeks they owned the place, suddenly saw that shot up to like $300 or $400. The companies that were actually maintaining these places, in some cases, were really sort of fly by night. So there really wasn't a good infrastructure set up for us. This whole thing had sort of popped up. It was like popcorn. It just popped up really quick. A ton of people were making a ton of money out of it, and you ended up with a bunch of these things. Now, one of the scary things about these timeshares is that if something happened to that industry, what the hell were you going to do with these things? Because we're not talking about one. We're talking about one after the other, after the other, after the other, just down this one section of the Maui coastline. So it gives you some idea of what we're looking at here, just this massive investment in relatively cheap, temporary housing. And unlike the resorts, it wasn't part of a complex. You don't have golf courses and other things tied into them. They're just there. They're just places to park yourself while you enjoy your stay on Maui. Or in the case of Kauai, you're in stay in Honolulu, you're stay in Poipu. So these whole sort of timeshare things, they seemed like a good idea, and people made a ton of money out of them. But it was probably more superficial than anyone realized it, when they started doing these. And this really came to bear when all of a sudden in I'm sorry, you're gonna have to Google. I'm not sure you'd find it. I'm gonna say arbitrarily 1980 or 1981. There was a Canadian couple that were attacked, and she was raped on the beach at Waikiki. I can't remember, it was somewhere near Queens. I mean, those things are rare, but they happen in Hawaii. But for some reason, the Canadian media, which was then, of course, broadcast or TV media, jumped all over the story. And their most popular network did a whole series of stories about violence against tourists in Hawaii, and violence against Canadians specifically, and how Canadians were being taken advantage of. And at that point, you have to remember, Canadians were sort of like the Japanese. There was a ton of money coming from Canada. Canadians were buying up everything that moved. And so, people were taking advantage of them. But the thing is the Canadians were doing this. It wasn't like people were suckering into it. They were doing it because they thought they were going to get something out of it. So the end result is amazingly this media fascination with why Hawaii wasn't a good place to go to and why Hawaii was dangerous blew up. And what happened is within a year, about 70 to 80% of your Canadian visitors to Hawaii disappeared. They decided Hawaii was too unsafe. They decided, all of a sudden they sort of collectively apparently decided Hawaii was not a good place to go and visit. It was dangerous, and who knows what else. But I mean, it's entirely tagged to that one story of the attack on the couple in Waikiki. There wasn't any other major series of events going on. It wasn't like people were dissing Canadians or something. So in that context, what happened is literally in the space of about 3 months, about 70% of these units in places like this just went empty. People just quit paying their yearly tab. They quit paying their maintenance fee, and you'd find that a lot of these things overnight would suddenly be 80% empty, and most importantly, there's no maintenance money coming in, so now they can't keep them up. And that was the problem with this whole thing, is you only own 1/52nd of this. I mean, you're trusting the other 51 parts are going to put in their share to keep it nice, so when you get there, it's like the paint's peeling off the walls, it's got mold growing and stuff like that. And that didn't happen. What happened is just the opposite. It all of a sudden, this place turned into a creepy, almost nearly post-apocalyptic landscape. Same thing happened down in Kihei, even more spectacularly because they were larger there. It was generally 6 to 10-story high rises. This happened with. So all of a sudden, you went from an area where a lot of these areas, if you drove down here back in, say, late 70s, you'd see Canadian flags flying a lot of these places. They wouldn't be flying the American flag. They'd be flying a Canadian flag and a Hawaiian flag. And that was actually, I suppose, sort of a signifier to folks that, the majority of people here are Canadians. Canadian flag disappears, early 1980s, within 6 months of that story. And the interesting thing is Canadians have never returned to Hawaii. Now, Canadian corporate investors have heavily invested in a lot of the resorts, like the Kapalua, the Ritz-Carlton Kapalua has largely Canadian investors, but not Canadians as people. These are Canadians, multinational corporations based in Canada doing the stuff now. Canadians have never returned to Hawaii. And that was, what, 40 years ago. And I've never seen any sort of discussion or analysis of why they're still staying away. Because Hawaii was their most favored location, and of those, Kauai and Maui were entirely off the charts compared to other places. Canadians were never big business here on Oahu, nor were they on the Big Island. But on Maui and Kauai, they were actually a big chunk, probably at least as large as the Japanese in terms of the tourism sector. And all of a sudden, pop, with one news story and one event, it just ceases to exist. This should probably get more airplay. I suspect the media here don't like to talk about it because they're afraid something could happen again with, say, Japanese. But on the other hand, what it does is it points out very clearly on the total fragility of the tourism industry. Tourism is based entirely on stereotypes, and the stereotype of Hawaii, of course, is that a friendly, welcoming place. And so if anything comes to contradict that and gets a large amount of play, people then sort of go, whoa, wait a second, that's not what I thought it was going to be. Here's the spooky side of it. And then in the case of the Canadians, poof, and they've been gone ever since. So it's in this context, especially Maui. They were the ones that took the massive hit. Basically, everything from here to here went empty in the space of half a year. And it wasn't like there was a huge economic collapse. It wasn't like, 07, 08 when the world, economic system went under. It just literally was people deciding that, I don't trust this place anymore. And then you not only have that, but you have the same thing happening down here, this whole section here. All of Kihei, the subdivisions weren't built in, but all of Kihei from here all the way down through to Kaanapali down here was all again these timeshares. And again, it just literally overnight, it just totally vanished. And here you can see this is the massive cluster of these enormous timeshares. And we're talking big structures here. These are just one of the really old ones here, I think. Yeah, this is one of the ones that always flew the Canadian flag. I mean, someone put a lot of money building that thing. And imagine the complexities of each of these units would have maybe 50 owners per year. And you'd have to have a company maintaining all this monstrosity and all of these different people all owning a bit of the piece of the pie, as it were. And this was one of the ones that was absolutely empty. For about 6 years, it was just taking up space after the Canadian collapse. So in some ways, this should probably be an important reminder to Hawaii that even if COVID ends, tourism here is an incredibly fragile industry. COVID just happens to be what's smacking it now. But if you go into the early 1980s, and it literally was one event and a whole series of news stories that did basically the same thing, shut down the entire industry, at least for Canadians, as effectively as COVID has now. And it took roughly 30 years for Maui to, especially this part of Maui, it took till the early 2000s for this area to even start to recover. And if you notice what happened then, is what they did is they built subdivisions. And you built condos that people would own a unit. So you went in an entirely different direction. One aspect of this from an environmental standpoint was that these things took up relatively little space. They had to be, by definition, because that's what tourism is, based on the beach. They had to be on the dry side of the islands. Ali'i Drive on Kailua Kona has some of these. But they were actually relatively small, relatively speaking. If you look at the amount of area taken up by these guys here versus the subdivisions that basically sort of replaced them financially post-2000, you can say there's no comparison in terms of the amount of area they're using. And also things like, water use, impacts on all sorts of environmental areas. The timeshare industry was goofy. It was incredibly opportunistic. It was totally not controlled. The state didn't get involved in it also. It's sort of like Airbnb is now. And the counties weren't really sure what to do with it. And to be honest, they didn't want to ask any questions because they were making money hand over fist. So it's sort of like now you never question tourism because that becomes the goose that lays the golden egg, and you don't want to examine it because you might break it somehow. In this case, what happened is it broke by its own, it just broke because of stuff. No analysis was ever done, but what happened on Maui is there was a lot more money coming in from the timeshares than there were from the resorts. And so all of a sudden, when this just literally, it's like the light switched off, the Maui economic cycle just went kapunk and the bottom fell out of it. It's in this context that you get the idea of part-time residents. And this again is going back to what I mentioned earlier. This is why Maui jumps on that, because they have just been absolutely slammed. And they got huge numbers of vacant residences and timeshares just going to ground basically. And they need some way to replace that revenue stream. And they're not going to do it with more resorts. The resorts were static. And so that's when you shift to this other model. And that's also why on the other islands, there's been not a lot of discussion about Airbnbs, because that's yet another revenue stream that still sort of replaces this. Now, what's happened, of course, is the timeshares now have been remodeled and turned into condos where people buy a unit. So it's not a week anymore. Now you actually buy it. But nonetheless, the fragility still remains. You get one bad news story scaring people about Kihei, and you very possibly can end up with the same situation where people just ditch, and this place could go back into a second cycle of sort of being collapsed, because it's all based on perception. Tourism is always perception based. So Maui's probably the poster child of this. One of the reasons, very simply, is that in the early 1980s, when this was happening, a Canadian geographer actually came and studied the tourism patterns in Maui. He was comparing it to the Gold Coast around Brisbane in Australia. Did this absolutely superb study of Maui tourism and the impacts of tourism in Hawaii in general. He tried to get it published at UH. I actually met him a couple of times because I was doing work down here. And he pointed out the UH wouldn't publish it because they were told rather politely the state didn't want to see that published because it was too critical of tourism and constantly gave a bunch of data to point out how fragile this industry was and the type of impacts it was having on the local population on Maui. And so the state didn't want it. So we actually had to go back to Australia and had it published there. It's Brian Farrell's work. If I remember, I'll go and check. I think I've got it set up as one of the recommended readings, but I've pulled out some pages that are useful, which you might want to take a look at if you're interested in this. So this becomes the whole sort of puzzle. Now, running parallel to this, in fact, this was part of my dissertation, was not these guys, but the thing was running parallel. If you go back to the 1960s, 1970s, there was what was oftentimes now called the counterculture movement. I actually call it the New Age movement, but whatever. For you guys, this is a historical thing out of maybe like South Park or something like that. This is the hippies. And so what you had in the mainland United States, and this was a middle class thing. What you had was a generation, basically your age group, slightly younger, who was not happy with middle class American lifestyle, were looking for alternatives. In many cases, what they did is they were looking for cultural alternatives. So they decided that the American lifestyle was bad. And so what they did is they tried to come up with, they were searching for other lifestyles. And so what they did is they went to their interpretation, which tend to be pretty naive, of other cultures. And from that, they basically built, if you would, a new they envisioned a new way of doing stuff. And so this was the New Age, or the sort of the hippie counterculture movement of the 60s and 70s. Places like San Francisco were a big center of that. Ironically, what happens is Hawaii ends up as a huge center of this. And again, it's sort of the same islands. Now you have to remember, these folks are not going to be the folks involved in the timeshare industry. They're the opposite of that. But in their own strange way, the two groups ended up in the same places. The counterculture movement had two centers here in Hawaii. One was Hanalei on the Kauai, which it still is. You can still find a ton of, folks my age with long hair and beards that were hippies back in the 60s or 70s, who now run like, food shops or something like that in Honolulu, and have since they moved there in, say, 1970 and stayed at Taylor's Camp, which we'll get into later. On Maui, what happened is they discovered Maui and came up with several logics. One is they took the visual representations of Halakala, especially the crater, which we saw, remember that helicopter thing? And they decided that Halakala was actually one of the crystal center points of the planet. We don't have time in this class to even explain that, and you just sort of have to take that on faith. You can go search it sometime. They decided that Halakala was actually one of the centers of energy for planet Earth. And so if you wanted to discover this new world they were trying to find, a really obvious place to go was Maui. So what you got very, very quickly by the early 1970s was tons of folks from, with a fair amount of money to spend, that decide to come and live their new stereotype of what in many cases was a stereotypic Hawaiian lifestyle. I would argue that to a certain extent, Moana and even Lilo and Stitch in many ways was written by folks that at some point when they were growing up picked up part of that stereotype of their view, the Western view of the Hawaiian lifestyle, the idyllic tropical lifestyle. And for folks in the 60s and 70s who hated American culture, this was like the logical alternative. It's about as far away they thought you could get from being American. Now, having said that, they still wanted to be able to buy stuff. They still wanted to be able to drive around. So in many ways, they weren't leaving American culture. They were just trying to build their own sort of subset within it. They very quickly became a huge force in several places. For one reason, I've never actually looked at this group. I never studied. Was the group around Paia and Haiku. And so very quickly they start moving there in the 60s and 70s. I think that at one point there were 37 communes around Haiku, which was actually more than they had outside of San Francisco. So what you get is people live communally for a period of time, sort of rediscover themselves, wander out in the woods, and make themselves into whatever it is they want to make themselves into. Because this was basically a movement of self-discovery. You rediscovered who you were, you built yourself a new religion, you lived in a new place, and you made the new you. And you made very clear that it wasn't like the old you. So this became one center of this, and by the 80s, this had moved up sort of to Makawao and Paia. The other center, which is where I did my research, was over here in Kanaio, which is a little strange because if you notice when you look here, there isn't exactly a lot. Kanaio isn't exactly a huge pile of people. But what they did is they decided that this part, because it was isolated, was another place to do this same thing, to basically build a new you. So one of the things they built here, let's see if we can find it. So it's a little hard to find. Okay, here it is. If you look it up here, you really can't tell, but this is actually a Tibetan black hat temple that was built by a group of communers who moved here in 1977, 1978. They built several structures. The main one is the center temple, which is right here, and then a set of retreats. They then were able to tie this in because again, because they're counterculture groups, and in many cases they were looking for other religions. In this case, this particular group became very closely tied to the Black Hat Buddhist, which is the main sect in Tibet. This is the Dalai Lama's group. And so what they got is they got this basically certified, I don't know what you want to call it, by the Dalai Lama. And as of today, even still now, if the Dalai Lama is going through crossing the Pacific, he stops on Maui, takes his 3-car, black, SUV, entourage, and they go and they spend a day or two cleansing themselves. This is considered to be one of the few spots outside of Tibet and northern India that's considered sacred. Now, this was entirely built in the 1970s, and the reason it was here is because it's on the slopes of Halakala. So for a lot of groups by the 70s, Maui had become the spiritual center of the world. And you can still see this if you go into Makawao and Paia, the number of places there are like crystal shops, self-healing, all sorts of meditation. Yoga is an enormously powerful thing on Maui. And it's this group that pretty much, sort of sets that up. So Maui, on one hand, had this weird juxtaposition. Notice how they're not that far apart. You actually had folks, for example, here, who are convinced that, the world should go back to a natural health food version. In fact, the health food movement in Hawaii is started by these folks. So if you're going to, was it Down to Earth or even Whole Foods, which is a more mercantile version, you're actually looking at that type of discussion. The juice movement started on Maui. So all that is going on simultaneously in a very weird way with your timeshare folks down here on the coast. These two things are running parallel. It's sort of hard to figure out how they interface. There's never part of my dissertation, but it did in some weird ways. But this became, in a weird way, this became key. Because the only thing these two groups had in common is they saw Maui, and specifically this part of Maui, as being a place to escape from the rest of the world. So if you joined a commune outside of Makawao, you were escaping, American society in the 1970s or even 1980s. If you bought a timeshare unit down here for at least a week or two of the year, you were escaping home in Denver or San Francisco or whether for a couple of weeks a year. So the escape logic that you could escape to paradise, which if you think about it is sort of different than the tourist before. And the tourists that say it in Waikiki or something like that are enjoying paradise, but I'm not sure if escape was a really big thing. The big thing that was marketed to both these groups is sort of isolation. That if you're on Maui, you didn't have Waikiki, you didn't have big shopping malls, you didn't have big shopping centers, you didn't have, the Gucci store and stuff like that. That wasn't what either of these groups was after. Both these groups wanted to escape to another fantasy world. If you would, Maui was seen as a version of Disney World or Disneyland, but it was a Hawaiian Disneyland versus a sort of Howley Disneyland, and that has persisted. The amount of this you still see, especially in this part of Maui, is mind-blowing. The number of folks that are part of that and have come since then. Because what happens is once this area ironically starts to get developed, especially Makawao and Haiku, which very quickly turn into all sorts of stuff. And I expect if we drop in here, we'd probably find all sorts of, oh yeah, okay. You can still find all sorts of like meditation centers and stuff like that. In fact, in a second, I'll pull up one of these. What you find is that because that gets a little too busy, then the folks that really want this idea of isolation go wander down here and they end up over here. Now, in the United States, especially the western part of the United States, by the mid-1980s, what had been a sort of religious spiritual movement starts to segue and becomes very popular with people that have a lot of money. So what originally had started as a middle-class movement very quickly scales to the upper class. And what happens is what they do is they're not interested in necessarily the counterculture religious stuff, but what they really love is the idea of escape. And this is when you get the movie stars, this is when you get all the, especially the musicians, and this is why Oprah and them folks all own places over in Hana, and not surprisingly own places over here and somewhere either Makawao or this part of Maui. This is why Maui is still today, and that's why they have the Arts Center. That's why they have all sorts of arts events. You'll get a lot of musicians and groups once COVID ends that'll go to Maui, they'll never even bother showing up on Oahu. Why? Because there's a ton of people with a ton of money tied to the arts that have decided Maui was the place they escape from the rest of the world. And that's because of the New Age folks back in the 70s, the hippies. So Maui still has that image. And it's a big part of what Maui sort of markets. And I think in large part, that's why Maui was initially so successful with part-time residents. You could buy property over here, you could build a big house, and what you're doing is you're sort of partaking of that same idea of the emotional low stress escape from the reality of the world. Let's see if we can fish this up. Hang on a second, I should have brought this up, but I forgot to. I normally would have you guys watch this on your own, but this one requires some explanation. Okay, no, good, it's only 6 minutes. Okay, let's see if I can switch over to this. I've never tried, actually, I don't think I've ever tried to watch a video in this class and see if this works or not.
Over the course of the last 2 years, Lemuria has really matured and grown.
Okay, can you guys hear that? Can you guys see the video?
Yeah, we can.
Okay, good. Now, this is an example of the New Age movement that's been brought up in the 21st century. This is from about 4 or 5 years ago. This is uniquely Maui. Oahu's never been able to partake of this because Oahu's too westernized. Kauai has jumped into this in a big way. Big Island has gone a different direction, sort of Pahoa. So if you visualize on one hand, remember the sort of fake ranches sorry, I shouldn't say it that way, the fake ranches in Waimea. So that's the big island, there's the ranching image. This in many ways is the Maui image.
Grown into even something more than I originally intended it to be. You know, physically, Lumeria has actually grown into having its own pool and spa, which we didn't have when we first originally opened. And we now have a 1,500 square foot yoga shala that actually is in the Whispering Pine Forest. That is such an amazing place to have like a romantic evening yoga practice. And it's actually beautiful during the day as well. Almost every guest that has visited Lumeria has said that when they've taken a look at the website, that the website actually hasn't captured the energy and the beauty of what is here on this property. What people love about Lumeria is that they're actually experiencing like an authentic experience of Hawaii. You know, it's very different than going to a resort or a retreat center. We like to put in the term educational. The lifestyle and the experiences that people have here at Lumeria of a morning meditation and a morning yoga practice and eating farm to table meals in our dining room and doing an aromatherapy class, which we've added to our schedule, and a horticulture class on how to actually create your own organic gardening at home, you know, along with many other programs and classes.
Okay, from an environmental standpoint, what's really sort of fascinating, because remember he's talking about a Hawaiian experience. What do you see right here where I froze the image? Anyone recognize that species of tree? These are the ironwood trees. They're brought over in the late 19th century to be used as water retention features. They absolutely have no relationship to the Hawaiian Islands. In fact, if you ever have to deal with one, they're a terrible pain because a tree like this, small as that is, they're called ironwood for a reason. You basically can't chop it down with a chainsaw. You'll blow out the chain on the saw, and this thing will still be there. So they're an absolute nightmare to deal with. They're also toxic. The needles, or whatever you want to call this, they look like needles that come off of this thing. Actually have an oil like eucalyptus does. This is all just basically the dried, needles. And notice how there's no vegetation under it. That's because basically nothing can survive. So where you find ironwood, you see these up, some of them up at the top of St. Louis Heights. They were planted up there also. These were all intentionally planted by forestry in the early 20th century, and they're part of an exotic life. There's nothing here that has to do with the Hawaiian environment. So when he's talking about an authentic Hawaiian experience, it's really sort of fascinating because there's very little in anything that he showed that has anything to do with authentic Hawaii, if you're thinking of like Hawaiian in the sense of Hawaiian culture. Now, what he's talking about is this 1970s hippie new age Hawaii, in contrast to, say, American society in LA or something like that. But it gets really sort of trippy here. So if you remember, even the term Lumeria is, I believe, tied to some of the new age crystal healing stuff. So even the name of the place is tied specifically to, very exotic, foreign type of things. Again, the yoga, etc.
It's really like flushed out Lumeria to a very like mature, exciting experience where many people spend the entire day just being at Lumeria. Lumeria is at a particular spot in the island where you can actually have an amazing access of other adventures and experiences. The beach is just 2.5 miles down Baldwin Avenue, and there's many hikes really being and connecting into nature, going up to Haleakala for sunset and sunrise ceremony.
Notice how the importance of the mountain in all this, and the importance of nature, but from a very Western point of view. There's no relationship that people have personally with this. They're not talking about their ancestors or clans. That this is a personalized, self-experiential thing.
There's upcountry, which is just 15 minutes away. I have been so deeply moved over the last couple years of, watching and experiencing the people that have come through Lumeria and have watched them unplug and participate in classes and programs and adventures on the island. And I've seen people come in and 4 or 5 days later when they're leaving, I actually see like the birth of another being, like a connection to something authentic in them.
So notice how this emphasis on like spiritual escape, not physical or visual escape, but you actually spiritually can rebirth yourself or regenerate yourself in a different way that's unique to the location. So it's location specific, it's geographic. You couldn't have Lumeria somewhere else. It has to be on the slopes of Halakala, and it has to be on Maui.
The experiences of being in nature, it's the experiences of Maui and its mana and the energy that's here. And then the care and the love of the staff that works at Lumeria completely blows me away, because they are authentically loving and here to truly serve all the guests that come here. Lumeria is really about a place in which I get to serve and welcome as many of my human family as possible, to love them and care for them and nurture them and allow them the space in which to unplug and re-remember who it is that they are. You know, by putting meditation and yoga as a practice in the morning, you know, and then beginning a day of action, the action actually moves much smoother in any particular day. For me, Lumeria is about reminding people about the quality of the food that they eat, the experience that they have on a daily basis, how their life starts on a daily basis. We're really
One of the things, if you look at all this stuff, and this isn't part of this class, but in my design class, is how much of this actually has anything to do with Maui, or actually sort of Hawaiian in the sense of Hawaiian values. What do you see in this spot where I froze it? How much of this has anything that's specifically to Hawaii? If Anthony showed us this picture, you just had this as a snapshot, and you said, where is this place? Would you have any way to indicate that it's in Hawaii?
I don't think so.
Oh.
No.
No, totally not. It's generically whatever. And in fact, if you think about it, here you've got the Buddhist images outside, you've got the lawn. That could be, you know, that could be in San Diego. It could be in Florida. It could be any place that's warm. There's nothing about this, despite the rhetoric, that it's unique to Maui. What you're trying to do is you're trying to make people that are part of the Anglo-American world comfortable, and to do that, you basically take their comfort level with them and you put it here. So it's not really, you're not really trying to teach people about Hawaii per se. I mean, you're trying to reinforce their stereotypes, and especially the one that Maui specifically is a place to spiritually and emotionally and cognitively escape.
trying to educate people in remembering to center, to be, to begin their day.
No emphasis on individualism.
Busy days, but to begin their day in a grounded state, in a place of peace, so that the day can actually flow in a much different way. We have a few new offerings here at Lumeria Maui. We have a resident shaman who actually studied with shamans in Peru and is from Australia.
From an anthropological standpoint, this is absolutely fascinating. It's very typical of the New Age movement in Hawaii. The authenticity of these folks has nothing to do with Hawaii. So this guy's not a tohunga. He's not some sort of a spiritual healer that's grounded in some sort of traditional Hawaiian practice. His certification is from other parts of the world, but there are other parts of the world where they're considered ethnic. So you study from Peruvian, you know, Ayacucho or some other tribe like that. You then get certified because you're somehow from, you know, out in the outback in Australia. So what you do is the key here is what they're emphasizing is he's not from mainstream American society. And he doesn't live in Brisbane or Sydney if he's got an Australian accent. So you're trying to build a world of differences. In fact, if you notice, I've never noticed this before since I use this ad all the time. Look at the landscape in the background. Here you've got your ironwoods. Of course, this is sugarcane. So what you've actually got is a leftover sugar plantation part of the old A and B upcountry plantations, which is where this thing is. So in this context, what you've got is nature doesn't have to be part of a Hawaiian environmentally resonant landscape that reflects the Hawaiian environment of the past. In fact, I'm pretty sure I don't see any plant in this picture right here that's actually from Hawaii, that would have been there, say, even 150, 200 years ago.
And grew up with the Aboriginals. His offerings are here daily. We also have a Zen master that sits here 4 hours every day. And we've expanded our wellness program. We now offer colonics, facials, massages in the massage studios, massages in the forest overlooking the North Shore and the ocean, and massages in the Coconut Grove. We now have a pool and jacuzzi, and it actually sits at a point on the property that overlooks the West Maui Mountains, which is a really beautiful place to sit and watch the sunset at night. So something new and amazing that's happening at Lumeria. We know that music actually connects people in a profound way, not only to themselves, but to all the people that are actually listening. We've started musical evenings here at Lumeria, offering amazing talent that is just hidden in every nook and cranny on Maui. Whether you're a guest or just staying here on Maui or part of our Maui community, you're welcome to join us for musical evenings. And most of the evenings are actually connected to raising money for different nonprofits, for local charities and international charities. I invite you to come experience Lumeria Maui and see what every single person says the moment they drive on the property. I promise you, you will go home recalibrated and restored and reconnect to a part of yourself that may be too busy to hear in your everyday life. But here at Lumeria, you have the moment and the time in which to reconnect to the beauty of the soul that you are.
Want to go to Lumeria? I assume that they're probably shut down now, maybe not. When they reopen, it's usually $300 to $600 a day. I believe if you want the full cycle of stuff, it's about $700 or $800 a day. And they were booked up. I'm sure it's all different now, but till COVID hit, they were booked up about 6 months in advance. So what you get is you get these other systems running parallel. Some islands pick up on that, and what you find is in many ways they're still there now. So folks from other parts of the world go to different parts of the Hawaiian Islands because there's a whole complex series of stereotypes that have been built, in some cases since the 1970s, that are island or even place specific to islands. You don't find any of the New Age movement, for example, in West Maui. It's all based on the slopes of Halakala. You find the New Age movement on Kauai on the Honolulu side, the Princeville side. You don't find it in the South and Koloa side. Big Island, you find some sort of version of real escape back to the lands around Pahoa, down to Orchid Estates. But that's sort of a whole different thing. Oahu just don't got it. And what that does is that reinforces yet another sort of complex overlays of views of place. Then the case of Maui is probably one of the main reasons why Maui is one of the most successful resort areas in the world. And it's because I think in part they've managed to package this idea that, like that guy said, you go to Maui and rediscover yourself. So at that point, rather cleverly, you could go back to the same place again and again and again every time you feel a need, because you're not going there to escape reality by seeing something different. You're going to escape to basically feel something different. So Maui goes a different path, and for better or for worse, that tends to just segue perfectly into this idea of the part-time resident. Now, one of the side effects of this, rather strangely, is Maui's been very poor at marketing brand, unlike the Big Island. Kona coffee, Kau coffee, and stuff like that Big Island's been pretty good at marketing brands. Maui, for some reason, hasn't. I'm not sure. I have some suspicions on that, but I'm not going to bother sharing them because I don't have any proof for them. But one of the huge side effects of this is because it's a more rural island, a suburban island, is there's almost no rentals on Maui. So if you move to Maui, for example, one of my nephews had to move back to Maui, teaches at MCC, and it took him 4 months to find a place to rent, because between the Airbnbs and the condo owners and stuff like that, there's a tremendous amount of money being spent on places. And so if you're a local folk and you need to find a place to stay, you can't. This is very true, not quite so bad on the Big Island, at least not Hilo side, but it's very, very true also on Kauai. There are no rental properties available. And so what you have is between the sort of traditional population, what you might call the local population, and this very wealthy group. And if you think about the Lumeria, the people that Lumeria is going to attract, there's this tremendous disparity in terms of the relative amount of money they're making and the amount of money they have to spend. And this would also include the folks that are working at places like Lumeria. That guy that's the shaman that they've got, the ladies that do the massage, they're not making a ton of cash either. But most of them are going to actually be imported. They're not going to be from here. And this is one of the things that Farrell pointed out when he did his study back in the early 1980s, is that tourism on one hand advertised it was going to generate X amount of jobs, and that's true, it did. But what he found out in the case of Maui is a good 70 to 80% of those jobs were actually taken by folks that then moved to Maui to take the jobs. Because what you wanted was the expertise in dealing with tourists in that situation. So you wanted to hire someone who was a masseuse that already had experience in that job. That generally meant they were from San Diego or they'd worked in Cozumel or some other place. You weren't going to train folks on Maui how to do that. And so the end result was, even though tourism might add 10,000 jobs on Maui, a good 8,000 of those jobs would actually be new migrants to actually work in the tourism sector. It wasn't providing jobs for the folks already existing on Maui. That's one reason why the state didn't want to see Farrell's study, because the state has constantly hyped the fact that you need tourism for jobs here. And that's true, but tourism also drives in-migration for the folks to work in that sector. And so it's a much more complex dynamic than just sort of, you put up a hotel and you generate 600 jobs. That's true, but Farrell's numbers, as far as we know, are totally accurate, which means that those 600 jobs, maybe 80 would actually be for people already living, say, here on Oahu. The other, 520 would be actually people moving to Oahu that are going to take those jobs up. And you can see this if you look at the North Shore on this island, where a lot of your jobs in the, say, surfing industry are recent migrants. They're not folks that were born and raised here on Oahu. And this is something that, again, that is very typical of tourism business globally, but it's not something you see discussed here. And in part because no one wants to try to spend the time and effort to figure out what do you do to replace tourism or provide an alternative to tourism. And if you think about Lumeria on one hand would argue it's not tourist-based because locals can certainly take their services. But in large part, the dynamic of what they offer and who they're going to tap as an audience is not going to be the folks here on Maui. It's going to be the folks, on San Francisco or Denver or New York that are stressed out, or especially LA, which I think is a big part of their business. So on Maui's a real sort of handy barometer, and also it's small enough to actually study, and you don't have the complexities of the urban center, i.e. Honolulu, in it. So you can actually see the dynamics and interrelationship of tourism and the other industries much more clearly, just because you don't have a lot of sort of noise distractions. Okay, let's stop there. We'll do Kaho'olawe Friday. Yeah, that sounds good. It's a good place to start. Any questions about all that? I sort of went over a bunch of stuff really fast. You guys are all good? Okay. I want to ask where the rest of the class disappeared to, since we're only about 1/3 our normal size, but oh well. Okay, well, I guess if there's no questions, then we'll call a halt to the proceedings.